I will begin by giving some context to this research project. Shortly after I began to consider how computational thinking could be used to automate defenses against disinformation, Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. Most people in the democratic world are struggling to understand how such a war could even happen, let alone how to stop it. The surreal character of the war is heightened by the imagery and stories coming across social media that capture the horror nearly in real time. I intend to demonstrate that the dystopian nonfiction of Putin's war on Ukraine can be made sense of once one understands information disorder and how Putin weaponizes it. Putin did not invent the idea of using tools like disinformation to enable a war. In fact, this strategy stretches all the way back to the Tsars, and the Russian intelligence and security services have had a Bureau of Disinformation since 1923. However, over the last century, that strategy has had a lot of different names. I'm going to call it information confrontation for reasons that I will explain later on. You will also sometimes hear me refer to it as RIC, short for Russian Information Confrontation. RIC is not new. Though it has had many names, the strategy is consistent and many thinkers have analyzed it. Here you can see a few books that have come out in just the last couple of years. However, to my knowledge, no one has yet approached RIC as a computational problem that can be defeated algorithmically, so that's what I'm going to attempt to do with this research project. You might be wondering how I arrived at this idea, so I will say just a quick word about myself. I'm a career Army officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. I was formerly Continental Defense Officer at the Joint Operations Command and then an operational planner at the Cyber Component. I'm currently one of the military representatives to the Government of Canada's whole-of-government effort to counter Russian disinformation regarding the illegal invasion of Ukraine. However, with that said, this project is solely my own work and in no way represents the thought of anyone other than myself. I don't speak for the CAF or Canada, and when I am using Government of Canada sources to support my research, I will always cite them very explicitly. Here's what I will talk about in this video. I'll provide a quick introduction to information theory. We'll then look at how information becomes disordered. I'll speak very briefly about information disorder syndrome, or why information disorder should be thought of like a virus. And finally, we'll look at how Russian military thinkers have weaponized that virus into an offensive strategy called information confrontation. You may have noticed that my agenda slide looks a bit unusual. That's because most agenda slides look like this. Because my aim in this project is to use a theoretical framework called computational thinking to explain information disorder, I am using my agenda slide to introduce a concept called decomposition. Decomposition is the basis for all computational science. All it means is breaking a problem down into smaller problems and solving them one at a time. Usually, computer scientists will use some kind of decomposition diagram to keep track of all those smaller problems. The first subproblem we will look at is defining information, and to do that we're going to use the basics of information theory. Defining information is a great opportunity to introduce a second important computational concept, namely the concept of abstraction. Here you see a definition from Dr. Jeanette Wing. Dr. Wing pioneered the idea that computer science was reliant on a type of thinking that everyone could benefit from. In 2008, she discussed the primacy of abstraction to computational science. However, her explanation of that abstracting process is counterintuitive to some. She says that abstraction is deciding what details we need to highlight and what details we can ignore, meaning that when you abstract an idea from a given set of circumstances, you simply pick the details that are relevant to the problem you are trying to solve. Your abstraction is not meant to be an exhaustive quest for every aspect of a given situation. Once you understand this process, you can see how computational thinking is a systematic approach to problem solving. Now let's use abstraction to build a definition of information that is relevant to solving the problem of information disorder. There are basically 5 important insights from information theory that are relevant to disordered information. First, information resolves an uncertainty. My favorite example of this is a smoke detector. We don't usually think of a smoke detector as an information management system, but that's precisely what it is. By installing a smoke detector, you've automated the process of detecting the presence or absence of fire in your home. Right now, you're watching this video because you're fairly certain your house is not on fire. But you can do that because you have outsourced the uncertainty resolution process for given tasks such as smoke detection. If your smoke alarm started blaring right now, you would be less certain about your own safety and you would go investigate. That would be an example of behavior change. You were watching a video, but now you have to stop and do something else. Already we can see how information is explicitly connected to behavior change, and that will become very important when we look at information disorder. Next insight. Information is quantifiable, and that quantity is called a bit. 1 bit is the minimum amount of information required to choose between two equally probable alternatives. This sounds complicated, but it doesn't have to be. Once again, just think of your smoke detector. Your smoke detector communicates in binary code. It is either on or off because there is or isn't smoke present. That on, off, either or style of information management is the basis for all of digital communications. And that is just one example of how the resolution of uncertainty can be quantified. There are others as well. How information resolves uncertainty in quantifiable measurements will become important when we look at the ways disordered information becomes artificially amplified. There are reasons why this happens, and they have to do with the quantification of uncertainty, but we'll come back to that later. Okay, the third step in the abstraction. To understand information, we need to distinguish between information and data. Information is data plus meaning. When a series of data points indicates something meaningful, something that resolves an uncertainty, it is called a signal. You may have heard someone complain they can't distinguish the signal from the noise. Noise is data that has no meaning, data points that increase uncertainty rather than resolve it. How data points can be used to increase uncertainty will become apparent later on because it is a key tactic in Russian information confrontation, where the attacker will flood the information environment with so much noise that the signal gets lost. For information to resolve an uncertainty, it must be represented, meaning that it must be communicated to you in a way that you can receive it. What does that mean? Well, if I'm trying to tell you that I smell smoke in your house, I need to say it in a language that you are fluent in, or I need to draw you a picture or drag you by the arm to where I smell the smoke. The same goes for your technology. Your computer needs to have some kind of interface for you to glean any information from it. This need for knowledge representation is one of the aspects of information that is most vulnerable to disorder. For example, I can show you a picture of a real event but place it in a context that is misleading so that you will feel a greater sense of certainty regarding an untruthful interpretation of events. You may have seen photos attached to news articles that don't seem relevant to the story, but the picture itself feels emotionally charged. If that was done intentionally by the publisher, it would be an example of disinformation. This is the most important piece of the puzzle. Information does not need to be true to do the other four things. Untruthful information can also be a measurable resolution of uncertainty represented through a signal. Just because it makes you certain doesn't make it true. We often hear authority figures talk about the importance of making an informed decision, but that is not really what they mean. Hopefully what they really mean is making a decision based on truthful information. This is a very important distinction because often we feel more certainty when we are presented with disordered information that is easily understood rather than with factual information that is difficult to understand. So, to recap, there are 5 things we need to abstract about information to start decomposing information disorder. To know if something is information, we can ask 4 questions. Does it resolve an uncertainty? Can we measure it? Does it manifest as a signal? And can it be represented? Most importantly for our purposes, the truth or falsehood of the information is irrelevant to its ability to do those other 4 things. Here is where we can start to examine how information becomes disordered. The so what of that abstraction is that when a person's uncertainty is resolved through false, misleading, or irrelevant information, they suffer from information disorder. Now let's create an abstraction for that. Here's a reminder of where we are on the decomposition diagram. As I carry on with this project, I will continue to build this so we have a visual representation of the layered abstractions as they are being built. The same way I used information theory as the starting point for the first abstraction, I will use the work of some other experts to abstract information disorder. The definitions I am about to give you are my own interpretations of work done by an organization called First Draft News. They are a non-profit coalition that describe themselves as a network of journalists who investigate and verify emerging stories. But they also act as a kind of think tank that researches information disorder. They don't do much by way of attributing information disorder or explaining how authoritarian regimes use it as a strategic weapon. However, their research is very good when trying to understand information disorder from a theoretical perspective. So what you're about to see are my own definitions, but I will explain each of them with examples taken from First Draft and other sources. Okay, misinformation is false information that is shared without the intention of causing harm. Here you can think of unintentional mistakes such as inaccurate photo captions, dates, statistics, improper translation, or when satire is taken seriously. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false information that is intentionally shared to cause harm. Think of fabricated or deliberately manipulated content, such as audiovisual content, or intentionally created conspiracy theories and rumors. And finally, we have malinformation, which is true information that is shared intentionally to cause harm. Think of the deliberate publication of private information for personal interest, such as blackmail or extortion, or the deliberate change of context, date or time of genuine content. Once we understand these three definitions, it is easy to see how disordered information falls on a spectrum. So I took this diagram from First Draft because I really like how it visualizes the framework. I'm going to come back to why it is important in a couple of slides, but you can see it's basically a Venn diagram where the falseness of the information and the intent to cause harm when it is shared overlap, and in the middle you find disinformation. This is the one that is most talked about, but mis, dis, and malinformation are all important categories to understand when approaching disordered information. These are categories that were identified by First Draft in one of their early reports. These categories have since become widely used by theorists of information disorder. I have chosen to call them vectors of information disorder to continue the theme of disordered information spreading like a virus. I am now going to show an example of how this framework helps us to make sense of information disorder, and I would draw your attention to the satire parody category on the far left. In January of 2019, The Onion posted this satirical news article entitled, "CIA Issues Posthumous Apology After New Evidence Clears Osama bin Laden of Involvement in the 9/11 Attacks." Then, in October of 2019, the former Inspector General of the Royal Malaysian Police Force, Musa Hassan, shared this post on his Twitter account without explanation that it was satirical. When some of his followers pointed out that the nature of The Onion as a news satire site, Hassan's response was, "Wait for The Onion to deny it. If not, it means America allows the spreading of fake news." What he was doing with that one comment was turning a piece of misinformation into disinformation. Satire usually does not seem like an informational weapon, but it is often intentionally disordered. Satire is usually weaponized in order to bypass fact checkers and spread conspiracy theories. It can do this because satire requires a high degree of sociocultural context to be understood as it is intended. When it is communicated to an audience that does not originate in the sociocultural context of the issue being satirized, it is easily mistaken for truthful information. This example sounds relatively benign, but this tactic has been used very strategically and very effectively by a Russian parody website called Panorama.pub. In July 2020, Panorama reported that the Polish president had said the Polish army was ready to take over 2 Belarusian cities, as well as the rest of western Belarus. According to the Polish president's fictitious statement, Poland was preparing to protect areas that had once been part of the Polish Commonwealth. Following presidential elections in Belarus in August 2020, a wave of anti-government protests broke out across the country. Panorama's fantasy statement from the Polish president was seized on by pro-Kremlin media and woven into repeated disinformation narratives about Polish imperial aspirations and the West's aggressive plans for Belarus. You can see in this example two important factors of weaponizing satire. First, the lack of sociocultural understanding really makes this piece of supposed satire look like a legitimate news article. And second, Panorama always had deniability because they could say it was satirical, not meant to be taken seriously. So what does all that mean? If we know the vectors of information disorder, we can build interventions that will stop disordered information from spreading. So how do we do that? Coming back to the decomposition diagram, we're going to treat the spread of information disorder like the spread of a virus. I use the word virus here to call to mind both a biological virus, a pathogen that can cause an illness, as well as a computer virus, or a piece of malicious code. Both senses of that term are going to become important. We'll start by considering something called information disorder syndrome. Once again, I didn't come up with this idea. There was a paper published in April of 2020 that proposed treating information disorder like a medical syndrome. A syndrome is a set of signs and symptoms which are correlated with each other and often associated with a particular disease or disorder. The author of the paper, Dr. Nirmal Kandel, is a Nepalese epidemiologist who works in public health for the UN. Unfortunately, his paper is a very preliminary articulation of the concept, but it is good enough to begin doing some pattern recognition so that we can further our computational model. Though the concept of an information disorder syndrome has not advanced much, the idea of using epidemiological concepts to fight the spread of mis, dis, and malinformation is gaining some traction. In the last year, both First Draft and NATO have put out quite detailed studies on this topic. There's also been some really important work done by a researcher named René de Resta, who uses systems theory to approach information disorder as a cybersecurity problem. She argues that the problem is not disordered information itself, but the structure of the human and technological networks through which disinformation spreads. And I really love this quote by her: "If you make it trend, you make it true." She has proposed a model that she calls computational propaganda that demonstrates how malicious actors exploit network architecture to insert weaponized narratives into the information environment and then use artificial amplification techniques to make those narratives cross platforms, going from social media to traditional media and eventually out into the broader information ecosystem. So what? A biological virus, a computer virus, and an information virus all follow the same logic, and all of them can be weaponized. Which brings us finally to information confrontation. This is an offensive strategy rooted deep in Russian history, and it has led directly to Putin's illegal invasion that we are witnessing right now in Ukraine. Let's do a quick abstraction of Russian information confrontation, or RIC. The first detail of the abstraction. Information confrontation is a Russian invention, aka Russian information confrontation. The aim of RIC is to find pre-existing divisions in an opponent's society and drive wedges into those divisions to widen fissures within the target population. As I said earlier, there have been a lot of names for the strategy that I'm talking about. During the Cold War, the Soviet intelligence agencies called it active measures, but the strategy itself goes back even further, at least back to the Tsar's intelligence services of the 19th century. The second detail. RIC is a strategy to contest democratic political supremacy. Many people in democratic countries were under the illusion that the Cold War was a battle over the best way to organize a society economically, but that was not actually the fight we were in. From the time of the Russian Revolution, the communist leadership strategy was to use propaganda and agitation to disintegrate the democratic countries that opposed them. I am not inventing these words. These are the words used in Lenin's pamphlet called What Is to Be Done. Third, RIC is waged constantly in peacetime and in war. There's been a lot of talk in the media and academia about information war, but that is not really a good description for what we are talking about here, even though many Russian military thinkers do use it that way. What is important to understand is that for the last century, the Russian intelligence and security services have viewed disintegrating other nation states as something they must always be doing, regardless if they are in conditions of war or peace. They conduct information confrontation against their nominal allies as well as their adversaries, and always have. Sowing distrust and agitation in other countries is a task that is never finished. Another fact about RIC that is hard for a democratic society to understand is that RIC is a whole of society approach to strategy. Democratic countries tend to view national security and national defense as the responsibility of specific segments of society, especially that society's military and its diplomats. However, RIC weaponizes everything: history, culture, education, investment, the rule of law, and especially the media. Literally everything that makes a society unique is accounted for in Russian information confrontation. Many of us in North America and Western Europe were confused over the last decade when we saw Putin associating himself more and more with the Soviet past and dredging up bizarre conspiracy theories about neo-Nazi groups taking over Western countries. What we failed to understand was the larger strategy that produced those tactics. Strategically, RIC treats cultural heritage as an important avenue to attack adversary states. Finally, and perhaps most important, RIC is not ideological confrontation. Democratic countries struggle with this idea. We typically thought the Cold War was a battle between competing belief systems. The usual story was that communism and capitalism were competing theories of organizing a society, and capitalism won. But that was never what was actually going on. Ideological confrontation is about one group of people proving their set of beliefs is truer than another group's set of beliefs. Information confrontation is about destroying the idea of truth itself. That is why disinformation is such a pivotal weapon in Russian information confrontation. The so what of this final abstraction is that Russian information confrontation weaponizes information disorder to destroy democracy from within. I'll close here with a tweet from Darth Putin. He says, "We dictators don't do propaganda to make you believe something. We do it to make you believe nothing. Then you'll do nothing." This is a joke account, obviously, but I believe it captures exactly what the real Putin is doing, and I think it's a problem that can be solved. That concludes this introductory video. Now let's get on to the problem solving.